The new Street Fighter 6 trailer has everyone hyped, but I want to talk about the discourse on the topic of the new simple input feature named Modern Control Style and how angry some people seem to be over it, so let's break it down. Simple inputs and other accessibility features are nothing new to current day fighting games. They have been implemented in a lot of games, and despite different methods and design philosophies, there's one thing these developers non-verbally agree on. Easy inputs should always be designed with drawbacks. In Granblue Fantasy Versus, your special moves are put on cooldowns upon use. The length of the cooldown depends on the move and which version you use, with EX versions being on longer cooldowns. You can't use any version of a move when it's on cooldown, and your opponent can see your cooldowns on the HUD. When I use the full motion for a move, the cooldown time is near instant, and a prompt that reads "good" appears on my side of the screen, which my opponent also sees. When I use an EX move, it's significantly longer, and I have to consider using them very carefully. But when I use the easy input, the cooldown is almost as long as the EX version. And if I use an EX version with an easy input, the cooldown is excessively long. The point of balancing these inputs this way is to give new players a shortcut to meaningful play. If you can't perform a DP, you can use the easy input to still play the game and use it for your anti-airs and combos. The important part here is you can still play the game, and by playing the game, you get to experience more of the gameplay loop and the real fun of playing fighting games. You'll get to play so much that you'll encounter the issue of having your moves on cooldown often, and this will manifest into desire to learn the full motions so you can unhandicap yourself and reach new heights. These easy inputs aren't just shortcuts to perform special moves, they are shortcuts to the fighting game experience, and players that are introduced to these styles of inputs will outgrow them if they play enough, which is what anyone that truly loves fighting games should want. For fighting games to grow, we have to attract new players and keep them invested. These optional features are a great way to keep them around long enough to love fighting games. So how does Street Fighter 6 handle balancing this control type? This is the breakdown of the modern control style from their website. There are a few major points here. The first, that nearly everyone that bothers to research first and complain second has noticed, is that modern controls remove half of your character's normals. Note that the attack buttons say light attack, medium attack, and heavy attack, with no mention of punches or kicks. The second thing that hasn't been noticed as much is that the website doesn't mention how to control the strength of your special moves. Do we only get one version? What if Ryu gets his medium DP and you can't perform the heavy version when he needs the extra damage? We can speculate that we could simply hit the special button with the desired strength similar to Granblue, but I feel Capcom would have mentioned this somewhere if that were the case. So Street Fighter 6 removes half of your normal attack buttons, but is that enough of a drawback for these easy special moves? We can only speculate at this point, but we can form a strong argument that the drawback is actually staggering. To start, we know that the HUD in Street Fighter 6 tells you what control style your opponent is using. So if you know which normals your opponent doesn't have access to for their character, you can use that to your advantage. So what would that look like in practice? Let's use Chun-Li for our experiment. I've changed my controls around to try to emulate Street Fighter 6 modern controls as much as possible. I can't put special moves on a single button, but I have removed the use of some of my normals. Pressing light punch now results in a throw, medium kick is now V skill, and heavy punch is now V trigger. So I can still use the game's basic mechanics and play the game and use my special moves, but only certain versions. I can only use the medium punch Kikoken and the heavy and EX versions of lightning legs and bird kick. Note that the light version is allowed, but I won't be using it. I'm going to play a match with a friend and inform him ahead of time that I can't use these buttons, light punch, medium kick, or heavy punch. So we can see how an opponent could abuse this information, since they would be able to do the same in Street Fighter 6 due to the HUD. The issues present themselves immediately as my opponent has found a space where my best normals whiff. Back medium punch doesn't reach, and send heavy kick can't hit crouching. I also don't have a threatening low with no crouch medium kick, so checking his approach is both more difficult and less rewarding. These gaps in my ground game, which are normally covered by stand heavy punch and crouch medium kick, are a huge advantage he doesn't have to work very hard to abuse. He gets to fish for these kind of empty cancels and whiff punish opportunities with no fear. The best punish I can throw together with what I have left of my normals is back medium punch into EX legs, which only works on counter hit. Missing these normals isn't only hurting my neutral and ground game, I'm having trouble putting punishes together. My only ender here was just EX legs, but I was so desperate for momentum, I just hoped I was close enough for the V skill. I did remember about forward heavy kick, and I can use it here and there, but it's not really opening any new doors for me. I almost missed this because my first instinct when shimmying with Chun-Li is to use crouch medium kick, but under these circumstances, I had to just raw V-trigger activation. At this point, my opponent has just refined their timings and realized how belligerent they can be, and it just worked. This control scheme is much more brutal than Granblue's because you can't mitigate it. At Granblue's high level play, most specials are performed with full motions, but in last touch situations or when reacting to certain attacks, you do see the easy inputs being used. That won't be the case in Street Fighter 6. To be fair, I didn't get the benefit of one button specials in my example, but I don't think they would have helped with my issues much, if at all. It's ironic that the modern control style of Street Fighter 6 gives players something they can't do, but removes something they can do in exchange. So why are so many people up in arms over these modern controls? Keep in mind that DNF Duel is coming out soon with similar controls to nowhere near this kind of outrage, and I haven't even mentioned the similar systems in Marvel 3, so why now? I have some facts as well as some theories on that. First is the facts. Let's use this chart to help make my point and explain the differences between execution and skill level. For simplicity's sake, let's assume execution is doubling as invested time from the player as well, since it's the easier part to improve at with just grinding. Most people assume progression is a clean 45-degree angle on this chart, but that is very rarely the case. There's this part of the execution axis I call the point of intentionality. This is simply the point where the player can perform actions at will with high consistency. Players beyond this point are more often questioned on why they did something because they are competent enough to execute what they meant. But you might notice this point is very low on the execution axis, and that's exactly where the problem lies. By far the most populated section of this chart is right here. Low overall skill and just over the point of intentionality. The issue is that no one at this point believes they could possibly be low skilled because they are beyond the point of intentionality. The greatest threat to these players in terms of easy inputs are these players. Players with good instincts that just haven't found the motivation to grind out execution and go beyond intentionality. And honestly, these players are perfectly capable of mastering motion inputs given time, but that requires investment and it may not seem worth it to these players at the moment. The good thing about these players is they do tell on themselves frequently, so even if they won't admit their mediocrity to anyone, themselves included, they do wave the red flags. Now for my theory. I've been around fighting games for longer than some players have been alive, and there's a lot of factors that play into why fighting games have to be made so differently. First off, one-on-one competitive games attract the rarest people, and fighting games have to compete with other competitive outlets for said people. Card games, chess, speedrunning, Pokemon, physical activities all pull away from potential fighting game players. When I was growing up in the 90s, fighting games were the most popular type of 1v1 game. If speedrunning and high scorers were too indirect for you to consider them competition and you weren't into the burgeoning card game scene, then fighting games were pretty much your only option. This limited selection made committing to one and grinding through it easier because what else were you going to do if you didn't want to play a team-based game? Fast forward to 2022, and despite the last few years being much better for fighting games, we are still behind many other genres. Speedrunning has become a full-blown phenomenon compared to its origins. Card games are literally printing money. Pokemon is the largest intellectual property in existence, and we are throwing fits on Twitter about easy inputs that might help us draw in some new players. I've seen the remark that the new generation is weaker for having these, quote, training wheels. I think that's of a bit of an ironic, funny self-own. Think about it. Training wheels are for kids to learn how to ride a bike. They allow them to experience riding in a safe fashion until they develop the hand-eye coordination to ride without them. Sure, you don't need training wheels now that you've outgrown them, but are you going to demand your children learn to ride a bike without training wheels? That's crazy. Bottom line, these easy inputs are not going to ruin Street Fighter 6, and they certainly aren't going to help anyone win matches against players that are better than them. And if you comment on this video after Street Fighter 6 comes out and tell me I was wrong because you got smoked by a new player using modern controls, I'll know right where to find you. Right here.